I'm going to keep this very short because the more I talk, the less time you will have for the good stuff. Today is a day that I will remember for the rest of my life because I have the privilege to introduce someone, Dan Barker, who, after 19 years of preaching the Christian gospel, he finally left the faith and announced his atheism in January of 1984, something that not even George Orwell could have predicted. 8 months later, after joining the Freedom from Religion Foundation, he gave his first talk at the FFRF Convention in Milwaukee in September of 1984. Keep in mind, that is 40 years ago. In 2004, he and Annie Laurie became co-presidents of Freedom from Religion Foundation. That was 20 years ago. Since leaving the ministry, he has participated in 140 public debates and has written 11 books. On his latest book, he's donating 100 books to FFRF, so 100% of the convention's books sold go directly to FFRF. So, yeah. So, as a way of introducing this amazing person in his latest book, I'd like to dedicate to him this very, very short poem. There was once a preacher, Dan Barker, whose sermons in Mexico were sharper. From induction to instruction and spiritual production, but his faith faced a swift reduction. He preached once of sin and seduction. Now he writes on religion's destruction. From obstruction to function, God lost his conduction, and then found pure joy in reduction. With abduction of faith in the night, he embraced reason's bright reconstruction. No more church instruction, Dan's journey, a unique conduction, from preacher to atheist production. And that is not a contradiction. For more on this new word, I present to you my most admired friend, Dan Barker.
You mentioned Mexico? No? Okay. Dave and I will be speaking in Mexico City in November at the 3rd International Latin American Free Thought Conference, which involves freethinkers from many countries all over Latin and Central America. And David is quite the speaker himself. So, if you looked at your program, you might have thought that was a typo. My talk is Contraduction, and you might have thought, on the keyboard, the I and the U are right next to each other, so that happens sometimes. But it's not a typo. We actually have a new word. And it's a little bit bold to suggest I'm going to introduce a new word to philosophy, because how often does that happen? But it has caught on. Do any of you get the word a day that Anu Garg puts out every morning? It's a new word. You should sign up for that, because he explains a new word and a certain theme. And the first week of September, the theme was newly coined words. And he started the week with my newly coined word, contraduction. And he explained it, and I'll explain it to you as well. So he thinks maybe someday it could end up in the dictionary. So do a number of other people who have blurbed the book and have said they've read it and said yes, including Steven Pinker, who happens to be the editor of the New American Heritage Dictionary, the British philosopher A.C. Grayling, who's well known all over Europe. He read the book in one afternoon, and he is now recommending it. Ron Reagan, who we heard last night, gave it a thumbs up. Andrianne, the widow of Carl Sagan, said yes. Robert Sapolsky, the skeptic Michael Shermer, and of course the famous David Tamayo read a book and gave an endorsement. The sociologist Phil Zuckerman, Kate Cohen, who we heard yesterday, she read the book and she said it made her laugh. And I thought, well, that's a good response to a book. The Thinking Atheist, Seth Andrews, Matt Dillahunty, and many others have read this and said, yes, we think we do actually have a new word. What is contraduction? In brief, and I'll explain it a little bit more later, but in brief, it's a hidden fallacy that happens to all of us. Usually it's an innocent hidden fallacy that completely inverts reality. A 180-degree reversal of reality based on us assuming everything's from our human point of view. Have you ever been sitting in a train that's not moving when the train next to you starts to move and you briefly think it's you who's moving? Or a plane or a car? Has that ever happened to you? That happens to me a lot. I think, whoa. And then you realize, oh, I've got it backwards. Well, that's one example of contraduction. It's a 180-degree reversal of what we thought was true, but actually the inverse is true. And this has real implications with theology and apologetics. It has a lot to do with the design argument and especially the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. But it's not just religion. Contraduction is a reversal of any kind of order. It can be time or position, or it can be cause and effect. It can be relationships. It can be causality. I think the most ancient, most powerful contraduction in our species is the sunrise. Does the sun rise? Well, in this room, you know it doesn't. Yet we have the word sunrise. Why do we call it sunrise? It's because from our point of view, when we're looking at it, it looks like the sun is rising, when in actuality, it's completely reversed. It's not the sun, it is we who are rising. And so it's a complete reversal, and the correction of that contraduction in history cost some people their lives. Bruno was burned at the stake for going against the church's teaching that the sun goes around the earth. Of course, Galileo and others were persecuted because of that belief, and yet they got it. They realized things were totally backwards. Contraduction can happen with relationships. In the book, The Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann, a wonderful book about Oklahoma. Well, some of you might have seen the movie too. There's a photo in the book of an Oklahoma homeowner and her servant. This white woman is standing by the door of a summer retreat, and next to her is this very dark-skinned Osage Indian woman. Many people who view that photo would just assume that the white woman was the homeowner, but it was the other way around. The Osage woman had become wealthy from oil rights, and she had hired the white woman. So that's an example of getting a relationship totally backwards. There might be many reasons why you would assume the reverse, and we can imagine why, but whatever the reasons are, the reversal of the relationship is a reversal of a contraduction. This whole book started basically because one of our chapters in Florida, I was invited to a debate in March of 2020, put on by the Central Florida Free Thought community, and one of the hosts of the debate was David Williamson, and he and a local pastor had become friends, and so they wanted to have a debate, and they had this whole free flow event, and so one of the events at the event was our debate with Adam Lloyd Johnson. And it was a short debate. We didn't have much time to go into much depth, but during Adam's opening statement, he was arguing that the strongest argument for the existence of God is the fine-tuning argument. Have any of you heard that? There are many arguments. Fine-tuning is one of the design arguments. And he said, I'm going to be using abductive reasoning tonight to argue an inference to the best explanation. He said, I'm not arguing for the God of the Bible, I'm arguing for mere theism, is what he called it. Mere theism. And I'm wondering, well, what do we offer mere theism? Mere worship? But, and so he used that phrase, and I was thinking about it, and as I got up into not a pulpit, I'm so used to saying pulpit. After 19 years of preaching, you think once you're in a pulpit, I was thinking abduction, I know what that means. abduction is basically, and you don't hear it that much, but abductive reasoning is basically your best guess, is what it means. Sounds like a fancy word, but it just means you've got all these possibilities, hypothetical explanations, so which one is the best guess? Investigators use it when they're examining a crime, for example, to maybe come up with a prime suspect, but you still haven't convicted the person, you're just coming up with your best guess. So as I stood up in the podium there to do my opening, I said, you know what, I think Adam's reasoning is backward. He's got it reversed. And instead of abduction, I think we need a new word. And I was thinking on my feet, I was just ad-libbing, and I didn't, it was kind of dumb. And I said, maybe we should call it post-duction. Well, the audience didn't seem very impressed with that. And they shouldn't have been, because post-duction is not the right word. A couple of months later, Annie, Laurie, and I were driving down the Coast Highway in California. And it dawned on me, I need a prefix that doesn't mean after, but a prefix that means flipped or inverted or totally reversed, like this microphone is reversing on me here. And so the concept of contraduction was born. And I sat down to write what I thought was going to be a short article. And I worked on it. No magazine would, if they even answered, they said it was too long. I finally found a publisher, Hypatia Press, who said, yes, we'll take it. So it became the book, Contraduction. So in the debate, after I made that silly comment, I said, the fine-tuning argument, people are so impressed about how all of these constants and parameters and ratios of the universe have to be these exact values. If any of them is off by even the slightest amount, you talk about the force of gravity, the electroweak forces, the strong nuclear force, the cosmological constant. You talk about all these different constants. If any one of them were off by even the tiniest amount, life would not be possible in the universe. It just wouldn't be. There would be no life. We'd be in a dead, stillborn universe. And so Adam, in his argument, in his abductive reasoning, he said, what's the best explanation for this appearance of exquisite fine-tuning? In fact, if you take all of these variables and assume correctly that they can't vary by very much, it's estimated that the chances of life appearing by chance are 1 over 10 to the 60th. That's a teeny, 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 tiny number. It's a number. It's not zero, but it's so tiny that, chance doesn't seem to be the best explanation. And Adam says, the best explanation then must be the design argument. And so I got up and said, I think this reasoning is backward. It's kind of like the guy who's so impressed. Have you noticed how all those rivers were made to flow right along the state border? How do you explain that? If you think about it, it must have been a huge, massive civic undertaking and expensive to get each of those rivers to be exquisitely, intelligently fine-tuned to match the border. What's the best explanation for that, right? If that's the way you're thinking, of course, that's backward, isn't it? The rivers came first and the borders came later. Or it can be like the guy who says, look at the shape of the human nose. Look how perfectly shaped it is to support a pair of eyeglasses. How do you explain that? Well, I think the fine-tuning argument is like that. On its face, it's very seductive. How did they get those rivers to do that? But if you flip it around, you can see that there's a backward kind of thinking. So in my book, I do talk about religion, but really contraduction has a broader application. It can apply to time itself. Is time flowing or are we flowing? Like, is the sun rising or are we rising? Sleep, I have a chapter on sleep. Should we ask, what is the purpose of sleep? Or flip it around, should we ask, what is the purpose of wakefulness? Maybe sleep is the default and wakefulness is what needs to be explained. Or mirrors, I have a whole chapter on mirrors, which I don't have time to go into, but if you ever look in a mirror, it looks like it's reversed. Your right and left are reversed. They're not. The right and left are not reversed. Your right hand is to the east, that right hand is to the east, and the left is to the left. What mirrors reverse is not left and right, but front to back. If you point to yourself north, it looks like it's pointing south. It's a flip, a 180-degree flip. And the way to resolve this apparent paradox, and by the way, have you noticed that although left and right seem to be reversed, top and bottom doesn't? Why is that? Einstein even started thinking that years ago. Why is that? Even if you're laying on your side, why is it that mirrors do that? Well, it's because mirrors aren't reversing that way. They're reversing front and back. And the way to unreverse this paradox in your mind is to imagine that you're looking at a picture of yourself on a piece of paper, in which case you do see it like another person sees it. But if you turn the paper around and hold it up to the light and look at yourself to the backside, well, then it does line up. So when you look at a mirror, do the same thing. That image in the mirror is not looking at you. That image in the mirror is looking with you, through you, and you can reverse it around. And that plays into the chapter on free will, which I don't have time to talk about today, but if you're looking backward and past, we see strict determinism. But if you're looking forward into the future, like looking into the mirror, we don't know the future. So we have this illusion that arises that we have free will. And I think, by the way, that free will it's an illusion, but it's a beautiful illusion, while others think maybe it's a pernicious illusion. Many of the readers of the book disagreed with me on some of these chapters, and I'm glad. Some of them said, no, that's not a good example. But none of them disagreed with the whole idea of contraduction itself. And so you may disagree with a chapter or two. I have a chapter on design, pointing out that most design arguments, on their face, they look valid and strong. The basic design argument says, we've never observed design without a designer. The universe appears to be designed, therefore, the universe had a designer. That looks like a seductive argument, doesn't it? But science proceeds from what we do observe, and the design arguments go from what we don't observe. We could say, we could use that logic with all sorts of things. We have never observed an intelligence outside of a physical brain. God is intelligent, therefore, God must have had a physical brain. Well, you use that logic to produce all sorts of meaningless conclusions. The fine-tuning argument is seductive. Christopher Hitchens said he thought it was the best argument they have because of this scientific veneer to it. And Steven Weinberg, the agnostic physicist, even said, yeah, that fine-tuning argument, you got to think about it. You can't just dismiss it. Victor Stenger, the astrophysicist, who's a former member of FFRF, he wrote a book, The Fallacy of Fine-Tuning, in which he concluded the universe was not fine-tuned for us. We were fine-tuned for the universe. If you think about evolution, how we evolved to fit, if the universe had been different, we would have been different. If the river had flowed differently, the border would have been different. I also talk a little bit about the Kalam argument, which I think has some contradictory fallacies within it, which I think totally destroy. The Kalam is the cosmological argument that says, and William Lane Craig is one of its major proponents, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe had a cause. That sounds kind of cool, doesn't it, on its face? Well, yeah. And so that argument, they call it the kalam. It's an ancient Islamic word for the idea that there could not have been an actual infinity. There had to be a beginning, because if there were an infinite number of preceding events, we never could have traversed it to get to now, but we have arrived at now. Therefore, there couldn't have been an infinite number. There had to be a beginning. You combine that with Big Bang cosmology to come up with this Kalam cosmological argument. But I don't have time to destroy that. I think there's 5 killer arguments against it, which I put in the book. So one hypothesis other than chance or a supreme being is a multiverse. I do not argue for a multiverse. I even said during the debate, we don't know. A multiverse at this point in time is a hypothesis. However, it's plausible. It doesn't contradict any known laws of physics. A multiverse, many physicists are concluding that there must be or could be a multiverse, meaning a multiple collection of universes. And if that's true, then that raises the numerator in the fraction that produces the probabilities in the fine-tuning argument. And so if you have a higher numerator, you have more rolls of the dice, and so there's more chances to have a life-permitting universe, in which case we happen to be in one of those. What I point out is not so much that the universe is a factual argument, but it's a hypothesis, and so is the Supreme Being a hypothesis. So if Adam's going to argue that his hypothesis has some probability to it, I would say, well, then we can counter this hypothesis with this hypothesis, and like imaginary numbers that cancel out in an equation, or like matter and antimatter, that, those two would make both of those arguments, and we need to wait until someday when either the Supreme Being or the multiverse has evidence for it. Then we can ask whether one of those is the cause of the appearance of fine-tuning. When ancients were looking at the sunrise, they came up with all sorts of explanations. The Bible even says the sun rises and sets. And in the 2nd century, Ptolemy was trying to explain, look at the sun and the stars and the planet, and look at all this stuff. How do you explain it? And he came up with what's called the Ptolemaic solar system, which was this weird Rube Goldberg kind of machine thing of spheres within spheres and retrograde, you know what I mean, that kind of explained it all. But it was so complicated. And if he had just reversed the contraduction and realized it's not the sun that's rising, but you wouldn't even need to answer the question, because there wouldn't even be a question to ask in the first place. And a lot of these debates that theologians and apologists are raising they're trying to answer these questions that, kind of like Gilda Radner on Saturday Night Live, oh, never mind. If you've ever seen, I got it wrong, never mind. You don't even have to argue it anymore. And so a word for that is the word Waldo, lowercase w. Robert Heinlein, the science fiction author, wrote a 1942 short story called Waldo. This guy named Waldo is a very physical weakling, little teeny, but he builds this huge, fantastic Waldo pantograph machine that makes him look really powerful. And so today the word Waldo has come to represent any unnecessarily complicated, overly convoluted explanation. And a lot of these theistic arguments are Waldos, using a soul, the idea of a spirit, and all that to explain life. So there was a woman phoned up her husband. He was traveling, and she said, "Honey, I just heard a report that there's a vehicle going the wrong direction on the interstate." And he said, "I know, there's dozens of them." And I think a lot of these apologists are like that driver. There's all these Waldos coming at them, like all of these, what is that? How do we explain? The correct answer is not to just continue plowing headlong into those Waldos. I mean, the correct answer is to pull over, turn around 180 degrees, and just head back to the natural world.